Good evening. I'm Karolina Plášková. I'm happy to welcome here everyone, especially our today guest, an architect, Geraldine Dening. I'm in charge of the program of the Gallery of Architecture in Brno, which is now run by the Faculty of Architecture at the Brno University of Technology. And I'll show you few slides about the exhibition and the program which we are just currently running. If I manage. So, do you see the slide about the exhibition? Perfect, thanks. This lecture is actually part of the current exhibition, which is a project of Austrian architect Gabu Heindl. It's called Urban Conflicts, Housing Manifesto. It's on view until 10th of March. It has been prolonged. Go to Brno and you'll see it. I highly recommend it. And it's basically continuously growing exhibition where Gabu set some main points where she starts thinking about the housing prices and affordable housing. And she's continuously building the manifesto, which you can see there live. And these lectures, which we organize around, are actually part of it. And we chose the guests because they are dealing with housing and they can contribute to the housing manifesto. One of the object at the exhibition is a little care manifesto with little statements about care and housing. Gabu spoke about this also at the vernissage, at the lecture she gave in December, and you can check the lecture either at the exhibition or on YouTube, on the faculty's YouTube. Here are just a few pictures from the exhibition. And I just wanted to mention that last week we had a presentation by Viennese activists, initiators of housing collaboratives and architects, members of cooperative Habitat. There were 2 projects and we have 3 guests from 2 of them. Tonight we'll have guests from London, but I wanted to invite you also to lecture we plan for the 23rd of February, when we will have guests from Vancouver, Marika Albert, and who is from the Non-Profit Housing Association, and activist Wendy Pedersen from Downtown Eastside SRO Collaborative. We are also planning another talk with guests from Berlin about the initiative Deutsche Wohnen and Eignen, which is planned on the 1st of March, and then in the end, on the 10th of March, there will be the finissage with the Housing Manifesto presentation and discussion with Czech guests. This will be also in English because Gabu is coming to Brno and will present the manifesto. I had to mention that this project was financially supported by the Ministry of Culture of the Czech Republic, by the Foundation of the Czech Architecture, by the State Fund of Culture of the Czech Republic, and the city of Brno, and is done, of course, in collaboration with the Faculty of Architecture at the Brno University of Technology. And now back to our tonight's guest, Geraldine Dening, who is not only practicing architect based in London, but she's also a founder and director of an NGO, Architects for Social Housing, which is the reason why we invited her. And the NGO is actively contributing to discussion about affordable housing in London and in the United Kingdom, but also collaborate with local communities and work on design and feasibility studies for additional housing and improvements, usually in response to a proposal to demolish units in social housing in London. Geraldine Dening also teach at the DMU in Leicester, and we are really happy to welcome her tonight. I will end the presentation and pass the word to Gabu if she wants to introduce or add something, because she also, sorry, I didn't, if no one noticed, Gabu Heindl is the author of the project we are having in the gallery, and is an Austrian architect, but she also teach or lead a design studio at the AA school in London. So she already knew and collaborated with Geraldine Dening and Architects for Social Housing in London. So I'm very much thankful to both that they join us tonight, and I will make myself silent. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, but there's really not much to say. Just happy to continue a discussion we started, I think, like 2.5 years ago or so, actually at the AA, on when we also started to work, and which is continuing. Some of my students are again working on social housing in London, and mostly, and this is of course the heritage of a welfare state moment that is so much in despair or in scrutinized in question, and I think it's been really interesting how, Geraldine, you have we had a discussion on your work, activism, and also the role of architects within this condition. I'm just giving the word to you, and then looking forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you both so much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I've admired Gabu's work for a long time and really enjoyed the conversations that we've had. So we'll hopefully continue that conversation later on. So I will now share my screen. See if I get that right. Okay. We have the obvious question: can you all see? Oh no.
Yes, but we see the presentation mode, or I do.
Okay. You don't see the full screen.
Me not.
Again. Let's try this again, shall we? View.
Do the same trick as before, if ever we remember, right?
Now, what do you see?
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay. Okay. Let's try this again then. I'll try this. It's always slightly different every time, isn't it? There we go. Let's try that. And then we see. Let's try that.
Yes. That's
full
what
screen?
I wanted. Yes.
Okay. It's all a matter of process and order. Brilliant. Okay. Well, yes, thank you so much, Gabu, for inviting me to be part of what I think is an essential conversation around the future of housing. And I've really enjoyed watching your lecture, and I'm really happy to be the Architects of Social Housing can be part of the manifesto that you're creating. So if there's anything the past 2 years has taught us, it's that capitalism is crime. In the name of public health across the globe, we've witnessed the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of the world. Over £400 billion in the UK alone has been passed from the public purse into private hands with zero scrutiny, while the poorest communities continue to be destroyed and the public realm and welfare state continue to be dismantled. This only compounds events at Grenfell Tower, where we witnessed only a few years ago the devastating consequences of a system which prioritises profit over human life. A week after the Grenfell Tower fire, Ash convened a meeting to discuss what happened at Grenfell Tower and why. We were one of the first groups to publish a report on the fire, which was submitted to the public inquiry, its findings pointing the finger of blame directly at government officials, as well as the nature of the system over which they preside. The fire was a clear manifestation of the so-called housing crisis in London, and specifically a product of the housing estate demolition programme, of which Grenfell Tower and Lancaster West Estate, in which it sits, had been a part. In addition, the fourth industrial revolution currently threatens to propel capitalism into a new turbocharged era of vastly increased digital surveillance and control. Access to and the design of housing will inevitably play a key role in this, and if we're not very careful, will even further erode the agency and control of a resident over their home and living environment, something that is central to Ash's work with communities on housing estates threatened with demolition. In a conversation with a friend over dinner recently, we discussed how and where our futures are decided and how one can claim some agency over them. He responded that the political sphere was where decisions were made, so that must be the place where one must be in order to gain any power over the direction of our society, or more simply, our immediate environment. We encounter an impasse, however, when the majority of our strategic manifesto requires radical political change, which is not directly within our power to make. The expropriation of all housing from the private sphere into public ownership, which Gabu rightly demands, for example. So as a result, our book, For a Socialist Architecture, which we wrote between 2018 and 19 as a series of lectures at a residency in Vancouver, attempts to identify how, through the practice of architecture, in both a specific and an expanded sense, we might be able to assert some power over our built and living environment, and how this in turn might initiate a political transformation. So I'll start by giving a short context of the conditions to which our manifesto responds to in London over the past 5 to 10 years, and a bit of background about ourselves as an organisation. So we identified 3 key principles of neoliberal housing policy, which underpin the current situation we find ourselves in. That attracting investment in UK residential property from the private sector should be the primary source of revenue for house building. Secondly, that according to the law of supply and demand, massively increasing the number of homes, the number of residential properties for market sale will reduce house prices in general. And finally, that the sale of prime and super prime residential properties for the highest possible market price will cross-subsidise the provision of so-called affordable housing the rest of the population can afford to rent or buy. So why are these incorrect? Firstly, because private investment in the property market has qualitatively transformed housing into a global commodity, with investors speculating on shares in the value uplift consequent upon planning permission being granted on a piece of land they will never see and which may never even be developed. Secondly, because the law of supply and demand doesn't describe this property market whose financialization by global capital has driven prices up, as it is intended to, not down. And thirdly, because far from cross-subsidising affordable housing, let alone homes for social rent, and the sale of public land for the development of primarily market sale properties. It's funding the demolition, sorry, rather, than the development. So, so some of the costs. I'll run through these quite quickly, but I think it's important to understand the situation we're in. So between 2005 and 2015, at least £170 billion worth of UK property was acquired by companies registered to offshore financial jurisdictions. The real owners of more than half of the 44,000 UK land titles registered to overseas companies are unidentified, but 9 out of 10 of these properties were purchased through tax havens. In the second half of 2018, overseas investors purchased 57% of all homes in central London. Only a quarter of the residential properties with planning permission in London between 2017 and 2021 will meet current housing price and tenure demand. The total number of unsold new build properties in London on sale for more than £1 million has hit a record high of 3,000 units. And of the 27,000 conventional completions in major planning permissions in London, I've updated this, at 2018 to 19, only 6% were for social rent. 1,663 between 2018 to 19. Furthermore, the total value of the UK housing stock in 2018 was £7.29 trillion, having risen by a third over the last decade alone. 72% of the increase in this value was 137 billion was due to house prices going up, with only 20% of that increase coming from new properties being built. So in 2016, the 10 largest house builders in the UK, on the image on the left there, were sitting on land with planning permission sufficient to build 404 new residential properties, as well as holding option agreements to build another 480,000, but between them they built less than 30,000 new dwellings that year. And despite this, or rather because of it, the pre-tax profits of the four largest UK house builders rose from just under £419 million in 2011 to over 2.6 billion in 2016. That's more than six-fold increase in just 5 years. The largest builder, Persimmon, cleared £1 billion profit in 2018. So there's a direct correlation, therefore, between housing supply and the profits being made from it, but it is not based on flooding the market with low-cost housing. More than 165,000 homes for social rent were lost in England in just 6 years, between 2012 and 2018. And more than 274,000 people are homeless in England right now, including 126,000 children, according to Shelter in December 2021. So as part of our residency at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London in 2017, we used the space to research and compile a map of the housing estates under threat of demolition or stock transfer to housing association, which would lead to the loss of council housing. We identified that this resulted in a total of 238 London housing estates under threat, each one of those pins representing an estate in London. The expansion of large modern cities gives the land in certain sections of them, and particularly in those sections. So the consequences of this programme is the destruction of working class communities and neighbourhoods, and the vast movement of working class communities out of the city, as this research into the consequences of the demolition of the Haygate estate in central London by 35% campaign illustrates. The expansion of large modern cities gives the land in certain sections of them, and particularly in those sections that are centrally located, an artificial and often enormously increasing value. But the buildings that already occupy those areas depress this value instead of increasing it, because they no longer correspond to the changed economic circumstances. And as a consequence, they are demolished and replaced by others. This occurs above all with workers' homes in central locations, the rents for which, even with the greatest overcrowding, can never, or only very slowly, increase above a certain maximum level. The result of this is that workers are forced out of the centre of cities and towards their outskirts, and workers' homes and cheap homes in general become rare and expensive and often altogether unattainable. For under these circumstances, the building industry, which is offered a far better field for speculation by more expensive homes, builds homes for workers only in exceptional circumstances. How then is the housing question to be settled? As some of you may have recognised, that was a quote by Friedrich Engels written 150 years ago, but just as easily describes the current situation we find ourselves in. The fact that in many ways nothing has changed over the past 150 years reinforces the structural nature of the problem we are facing. The housing crisis and homelessness is not the failure of the system, but its success, as Gabu also stated in her opening lecture. And unless we acknowledge these systemic problems, we'll not be able to change them. So it's within this context that ASHA was established in 2015, and this is our original manifesto. We propose architectural alternatives to estate demolition schemes through designs for infill, roof extensions and refurbishment that increase housing capacity on the estates by up to 50%, and by renting a proportion of the new homes on the private market, generate the funds to refurbish and improve the existing council homes and estates, while leaving the communities they currently house intact. We support estate communities in their resistance to the demolition of their homes by working with residents over a period of time, providing them with information about estate regeneration and housing policy from a reservoir of knowledge and tactics pooled from similar campaigns across London. We share information that aims to correct unfounded statements and counter negative perceptions about social housing in the minds of the public, and raise awareness of the role of relevant interest groups, including political parties, local authorities, housing associations, property developers, real estate firms, and architectural practices in the regeneration process. Using a variety of means, including publications, presentations, reports, case studies, exhibitions, films, and protests, we are trying to initiate policy change within UK housing. These are some of the estates we've worked with to propose alternatives to demolition over the past 5 years, or 6 years now, in fact, as a result of which we assess we've contributed to saving the homes of around 6,000 Londoners. On the starting top left, we have Knight's Walk, Central Hill Estate, the Patmore Cooperative, West Kensington and Gibbs Green Estates, the North Wall Estate, and St Raphael's Estate, a number of which I'll be talking about as we continue. A manifesto for a sustainable socialist architecture under capitalism. I want to start our manifesto with these two diagrams, the one on the left illustrating the capitalist economy of architecture, in which politics is removed from the process altogether, and where all aspects of the architectural project are understood entirely as a portion of the financial sphere. The socialist and sustainable architecture needs to understand housing as the place where the social, the environmental, the economic, and the political spheres all overlap and interrelate in a total social phenomenon. A sustainable development or architecture is therefore one in which the relationship of these spheres or contexts is understood, balanced, and addressed. A sustainable development must be socially beneficial and economically viable. It's always the poorer communities who are forced to endure difficult or uncomfortable environmental conditions. In many cases, environmentally sustainable architecture can result in a very socially and economically unsustainable scheme. So this manifesto is going to outline some of the key principles of a sustainable socialist architecture and illustrate through our work how we've attempted to find ways to put these principles into practice. The social, we must situate architecture within the totality of relations of its production, distribution, exchange, and consumption, and propose new, equitable, and just practices for a socialist architecture under capitalism. We must understand the environmental, we must understand and reduce the totality of consumption within the finitude of global resources. The economic, we must design for and implement economic degrowth within the context of global housing demand. And the political, we must reclaim the political dimension of architecture to affect policy change. So what does a socialist architecture produce? Who produces it? For whom and how? And what value do its products have? A sustainable socialist architecture is produced collectively by everybody, by those who pay for it and those who inhabit it, by those who design it, those who build it, and those who use it, by those who argue, lobby, and legislate for it, by those who manage it, those who maintain it, and those who refurbish it, those who dismantle, and those who reconfigure it. These are all agents of a socialist architecture. It engages with the totality of its social, economic, and environmental context, and is, because of this, socially, environmentally, and economically sustainable. It is produced by and for those who do and will inhabit it, not as a commodity for those who want to buy and sell it. It meets the housing and civic needs of its citizens. It is never produced for profit, but in order to meet those needs. Its value, therefore, is always its use value as housing or other asset of community value, never its exchange value as property. And finally, all decisions and processes involved in the development of the built environment must be decentralized, transparent, open to scrutiny, and in the best interests of the local and wider community, who must be strategic participants and partners in the decision-making process. I just show an illustration there of the ladder of citizen participation. Interesting to think about the projects that we work on and where we sit on that ladder. So this is an image from our latest project working with residents on St. Raphael's estate in Brent. The environmental and economic consequences of demolition of the estate for residents, the council, and the local community are reasonably straightforward to assess, measure, and quantify. But the social consequences, however, are less easily quantifiable, but if anything, are the most important aspect and the primary reason for our involvement in campaigns like this one at St. Raphael's estate. In an attempt to understand and illustrate some of the existing social conditions on the estate and the potential consequences of its demolition, we asked residents what they valued about living on the estate and what they would miss if the council demolished their homes. As an example of residents' involvement in the decision-making process, while working with the residents of the Patmore Co-op in South London, we identified a number of old laundry rooms that were situated on the ground floor of most of the housing blocks which had fallen into disuse. We proposed refurbishing and repurposing these spaces to be DIY spaces that could be designed, built, and finally managed by the residents. So residents identified things like cooking facilities, gardening club, arts and designs, crafts workshop, get fit, dog grooming, business and job skills. These are all things that the residents proposed that they would like to see happening in these disused spaces. So part two, the environmental sphere. A sustainable socialist architecture must ensure minimal environmental impact and carbon costs across the whole life cycle, its use and maintenance, as well as its construction and reuse. Must never displace existing communities, residential or otherwise. must facilitate low impact and healthy living environments and increase environmental, social and political engagement and awareness. Must take refurbishment and improvement of the existing built environment as its default option. Must respect and improve the local ecological environment and biodiversity. The built environment cannot be separated from the natural environment and the people who inhabit and produce it. St Raphael's estate in northwest London was identified for demolition by Brent Council in 2017. And these are some of the embodied carbon issues around that we were facing when trying to counter the demolition of the estate. So most of you will be pretty familiar with some of these things, that homes are now responsible for 36% of London's CO2 emissions. The concrete industry is one of the world's largest producers of carbon dioxide. A significant fraction of the carbon emissions a building will make is locked into the fabric by the time the building is constructed, otherwise known as embodied carbon. And when a building is demolished, there are carbon emissions from the energy used in the deconstruction, removal and disposal of the waste. So these are some of the environmental reasons not to demolish the estate. So this is the St Raphael's estate, an overview. In contrast to the council's proposal to demolish all the 760 homes on the estate, we propose to retain and refurbish all the existing buildings, landscape and community facility, as well as add an additional 604 new homes without demolishing a single home. So it's estimated, the Model Environments is an organisation we worked with in the past on a Central Hill estate report as well. And they assessed that the carbon cost of each new home in the scheme to demolish and redevelop would be around 4 times that of a new home in a refurbishment and infill scheme. So 4 times the amount of carbon would be produced in the construction of the new fully redeveloped estate. The total embodied carbon cost of demolition plus redevelopment was estimated at 100,000 tonnes of CO2. And they concluded that even the break-even time due to higher expected energy performance would fall outside any reasonable 60-year lifespan of the new buildings. So in no way was a full demolition and redevelopment scheme going to be in any way environmentally sound. This shows a close-up of what we call the case study area of the estate, where we proposed a new town square, new community facilities and numerous other improvements to the landscape, including sustainable drainage and tree planting exercises. The shops at the centre of the estate could be refurbished and potentially accommodate a couple of floors of housing above them. Around the town square, which could facilitate a weekly market or something like that. And again, all these things were produced through conversations with residents. The existing buildings are, even by the council's own standards, in a good condition, and there's no reason not to retrofit these, simultaneously improving communal facilities such as the bin stores, which residents identified as being a difficulty. And as part of our proposals, there's potential for lightweight roof extensions to be constructed on top of some of the existing blocks, which could simultaneously improve access for the existing residents through the addition of lifts. So part 3, the economic sphere. Designed for and implement economic degrowth within the context of global housing demand, a sustainable socialist architecture must be not for profit, must make the most economical use of the existing land, materials and resources through reusing, refurbishing, recycling, improving and extending what is already there. Utilise and support local community funding networks and be funded by low-interest ethical investment partners. Adopt a transparent financial viability, procurement and management process that is overseen by the community. Must maximise the number of homes for social rent to meet existing housing need. Must explore low-cost construction methods and practices, but not at the expense of long-term economic, environmental or social costs. Be low cost to maintain and low cost to run, and minimise the project's whole life costs, including the cycle of maintenance, dismantling and reuse. And finally, designed for the long term, be resilient and flexible and accommodate change in its use over time. If we look at the social consequences of the economics of the two proposals for St Raphael's estate, our proposal for refurbishment and infill compared to the council's proposal to demolish and rebuild, we clearly see the difference in the use of land, starting out with 760 homes, the majority of which are for social rent. The Ash proposal resulting in 1,368 homes, 62% of which could be for social rent. And the council proposed home of 2,065 dwellings, of which half would be for affordable rent, but of which that was not financially viable in the end. There's no way, in order to make their proposal financially viable, they would have to sell 90% of the homes constructed, which wouldn't enable the original residents to be rehoused on the estate. So as a result, the council have decided not to pursue a full demolition scheme. If we look at the marketing literature for a neighbouring estate, we see the kinds of people who are anticipated to be moving in. These are not the kind of people currently living on the estate. So just to give you an example, professional couple, these are people earning in excess of £250,000 a year. These are not the residents of the current estate. When we showed this slide to the residents of the estate, they were shocked to see that this was the kind of clientele that was going to be living next to them. I'm not going to go into detail about the differences, but suffice to say that affordable housing can be anything up to 80% of a market rent, which is anything but affordable. So when we look back at some of the options that are being presented to residents and what is going to be built on these demolished estates, the vast majority are market rent and market sale. And as I said before, only about 5% of current housing in the UK is built in London is built for social rent, a tiny proportion. And of course, that's the tenure which is most in need. So to compare the financial costs of Ash's refurbishment scheme with that of demolition and redevelopment, we can see that refurbishing the existing homes with an additional 604 new homes would cost approximately £190 million. So this was costed for us by an independent quantity surveyor, Robert Martell and Partners, all of which could be paid for with the market sale or rent of half the homes, half the new homes that is, and government grants. While to demolish and rebuild the estate with the same number of homes, so we're just looking at, in this case, just the 1,368 homes, would cost around £542 million. So that's around 3 times more expensive to end up with the same number of homes on the estate. As I said, as I repeated earlier, this is in fact not even viable because they would need to sell over 90% of the homes to pay for construction. So as I said, the project is no longer going ahead. So I'll just briefly highlight a couple of examples of projects in which we've explored alternative economic models, and that's the Community Land Trust via the right to transfer and the role of the housing cooperative and co-housing developments in addressing some of these problems with the shortage of affordable housing. So to give this is an example of West Kensington and Gibbs Green estates, which we worked with a few years back, who were also threatened with demolition by Hammersmith and Fulham Council. And we worked closely with residents there on an alternative to demolition as part of their people's plan to transfer the estates into community ownership. That's an example of one of our events. And same as with St Raphael's estate, we propose to retain and refurbish all the existing homes with improvements to the landscape and community facilities. And we've been working with some housing cooperatives like Brixton Housing Co-op, shown here, and exploring ways in which they can increase their housing stock, in this case to accommodate young people coming out of care. We see cooperative housing as a fantastic resource in London, as many of these housing co-ops established over 30 years ago have amassed a considerable amount of capital, and so are one of the few organisations able to raise the funds to build. Obviously, the acquisition of land requires more than just money, but it's certainly considerable help. And finally, we come to the political sphere, to reclaim the political and social dimension of architecture to affect policy change. So a sustainable socialist architecture must not only provide an alternative model to the capitalist system, it must also disrupt and challenge the hegemony of that system, developing, expanding and exporting its social, economic and environmental principles through architectural practice. It must produce publicly owned housing in which public funds are invested, not market sale housing through which those funds are extracted, thereby becoming a means for the redistribution of wealth rather than its accumulation in fewer and fewer hands. It must design social equality into the built environment through equality of social housing tenure, through equal access to communal amenities, through retention and reclamation of public space, through equal access to communal spaces, light and views, and through socially integrated neighbourhoods, not neighbourhoods segregated by wealth. It must reclaim the political dimension of architecture that has been ceded to developers, planners, real estate firms, think tanks and politicians. And finally, must apply political pressure for the legislative, policy and cultural changes that will make it possible to further socialist practices within our current capitalist system. Just as an example of one of the projects that we've been involved with, Open Garden Estates is a project that we ran between 2015 and 17, in which residents on council estates across London threatened with demolition hosted events ranging from exhibitions to walks and talks. And these events both challenged the negative perception of estates as concrete jungles and havens for crime and antisocial behaviour, and as an opportunity for residents to build their campaigns. This is Mackintosh Court in Streatham, and there is Kate Mackintosh. We managed to the residents managed not only to save the estate from demolition, it's a sheltered housing estate, but also we renamed the estate after Kate Mackintosh, the architect, and that's her standing there, second from the right in the photograph. And this was Open Garden Estates at Central Hill, where they hosted this over several years, where there was a kind of planting campaign. We held an exhibition of the alternatives to demolition that we had proposed. There was an orchestra that was involved another year. We had puppet shows and all sorts to open up the estate and demonstrate what a beautiful community it is. And finally, on top of preventing the demolition of the homes on these estates, these are some of the recent policy changes that we believe we have been involved in achieving. So in June 2021, following the publication of our report, this is last year, Brent Council decided not to demolish St Raphael's estate, but to pursue an infill scheme. We are still pushing for the refurbishment of the existing homes, which is currently not being offered, but that's definitely a big success. In March 2021, a new scheme, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, was launched by central government towards upgrading public housing stock. From December 2020, so just over a year ago, the GLA no longer funds. The GLA is the Greater London Authority, so that's essentially the authority for the distribution of funding for social housing in London, no longer funds the rebuilding of demolished council housing, which is making it almost prohibitive for councils to demolish the housing, which is very good news. In February 2022, so this is just last week, the GLA announced a resident empowerment fund of £500,000 for residents on estates undergoing a ballot and threatened with demolition. So this is something we identified at a meeting with a London Assembly member in 2018. So we're very pleased to see that. In terms of the amount, it's obviously not a huge amount of money. That's the amount of money that was spent just on the consultation and architectural proposals for St Raphael's estate over 2 years. £500,000 was spent. So, but it's a start. And another example, in the current London plan, the GLA requires that every council must produce an alternative to demolition when they're proposing an estate regeneration scheme. So something we've been demanding as part of our work since we started in 2015. And finally, just like to repeat that architecture is always political. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we should applaud, but which more difficult in an online condition. Yeah, wow. We are happy if others also join us with, from the beginning in the discussion. Carolina, should I start? Yeah. Well, thanks for this very kind of structured and so demanding lecture in terms of this was, of course, something that I've also tried to kind of give it a structure, how to compile all these things that should be done. And I think it's really, I can totally follow you on this train of saying, okay, well, you know, it's like your work is part of many other works as kind of within an hegemonic struggle. And I think it's really great to see that things are changing also in London. And it's also changing also exactly because of your work as much as of many other works. And I was wondering to what extent or to what levels you find allied partners, how you see yourself embedded in a larger group of resisting architects, of maybe activists. How maybe you could explain a little bit how the situation in London is in terms of there must be many people who are kind of literally against the devastation of social housing. But yeah, just tell us.
So the sort of context of the campaigns in London, I mean, it's obviously changed quite a lot over the last 5 years and the last 7 years maybe now since we've been involved. But the last 2 years obviously has become very, very difficult, just in terms of connecting, partly because of the lack of access and physical presence and so on. So a lot of the work that we've been doing has been remote, which again, when you're trying to build a campaign, is very, very difficult. And most of the residents on St. Raphael's estate didn't have access to the internet, for example, necessarily, you know, or a decent internet that would enable for a conversation. So there have been, I think, recently, you know, there has been a sort of quietening down, I think, but for all sorts of other reasons, as we know. I think when we started in 2014, 15, there was a really very, very strong series of campaigns that we kind of emerged along with people like Focus C15, for example, Focus C15 Mothers, who were the ones who really inspired us, I think, at the beginning to do what we're doing. And I think over the last few years, I think that has changed slightly. I think, dare I say it, there was a rise in sort of a hope that the Labour Party might offer some kind of mainstream political solution to some of these issues. And I think a lot of people got sort of carried up with that. I mean, that didn't happen. We didn't have a political shift in that way. And I think that's partly why that's partly why our manifesto tries to, I suppose, engage with people on a sort of political level with a small p. Because I think there's a huge amount of emphasis on the political parties providing solutions and manifestos and so on. And what we've seen is that hasn't created the sorts of change that people had hoped. And so we've tried to, I suppose, redress that and look at how we as individuals or within our spheres of influence, whether it's architecture or academic or educational, or as residents, can start to have an impact. And I think what has happened is that I mean, there are kind of larger campaign groups, but I think what we're seeing is it's very local, these campaigns. So you have a campaign around St. Raphael's estate, for example, and unless you have, I mean, London's big, you know, so unless you have people who are kind of relatively local, the campaign can end up being reasonably local rather than being connected into a wider network. I think there are a lot of the campaign groups are relatively local as well. So the 35% campaign, which I showed some examples of around the Aylesbury estate, they're relatively locally, or, you know, organised around Southwark. So a lot of their work is evolved around those areas. And there are some umbrella organisations, but I think what happens is as soon as you get a larger umbrella, you also lose the kind of connection to the ground. So I think there's those, and also because majority of people are doing this in their, you know, effectively in their spare time. So I think trying to maintain those connections with the campaigns on the ground while maintaining a kind of horizontal network at a higher level across London is very difficult. And yes, there are some larger organisations which we're kind of contributing to, but essentially the work on the ground with the campaigns takes up the majority of our time. So you're
but are these projects, are they commissioned by somebody, or are you self-commissioning?
We're approached by the residents, so they've all contacted us to say sort of help, basically. And I mean, we get contacted by a lot more than we're able to support because we're completely unfunded. We haven't ever received. No, we did receive some payment for West Ken and Gibbs Green. Interestingly, that resident group raised some funds from a few different charitable organisations, and so they were able to pay people to do the work. But
Geraldine, I was hoping so much that you would say now, because I'm trying to motivate young people to go out there and do such work. And the issue is, how can we maintain and support that you can actually also make some sort of living from such support work, which I just wonder why some council officers wouldn't be so happy to have architects for social housing on their side. I mean, there must, due to the change in also the political understanding of how these housing estates are important. Don't you see a change? Wouldn't there be possibilities?
Not from the local authorities are they see the opportunities on the council estates for the profit that can be made for whatever outcome, in terms of whether that's filling the gap in their, whatever you want to call it, but they are resource. Unfortunately, they are resource for their funds, and so, for example, I mean, the only reason why one of the main reasons why St. Raphael's estate didn't go ahead is because they couldn't afford it, because the funding wasn't available, and they therefore weren't going to make the money that they needed in order for the project to go ahead. So it's fundamentally an economic question. And although I mean, I would argue that yes, our proposals are the most economically viable solutions, but what they don't do is change and I would argue this is where it is political, which is about changing the demographic of these areas. We're looking at areas which at the moment are kind of 60 or 70% or even higher social rented homes, and at the end you end up with something which is maybe 20% socially rented homes. I mean, whether or not that is politically motivated is maybe not for me to say, but yeah, I think we believe that our proposals are the most economically viable, socially beneficial, and economic and environmentally sustainable. So the only reason I can see that they're not pursuing them is for economic gain, essentially.
But you just argued that it is actually, and I think I was very happy that you brought in the class issue, the question of class, and to what extent yes, of course, economic arguments are always put to the foreground, but would you think that we should have a broader discussion on, I mean, just the word decanting is just so awful. I don't know, maybe you could just explain, like it's been used. Decanting is literally what you do with a bottle, right?
To pour out the bottle of wine. Yes, to decant.
But to decant is also what
remove.
What is said, kind of people are being decanted, right?
Yeah.
And
I think this is the point in a way, is that and I think to go back to your point about how they are not discussed as really as people. Yeah, the homes are not talked about as homes; they're units, and the land is an opportunity. It's a financial investment opportunity, and I think that's where you can talk about decanting. You don't decant in human beings; you decant an object, a liquid, perhaps, or a thing, and it's the dehumanization of the people that live on these estates which facilitates this process, and I think what's very interesting is that not now, but part of some of the work we've done is photograph, obviously, the people in their flats, and it's amazing how much this changes people's perception of these places, not simply as opportunities for investment, but as homes. And I think that's something which is being deliberately suppressed in terms of the understanding, and so from the perspective of the local authority, the developers, the architects, dare I say it as well, who don't want to be seeing these as individuals. It's much more convenient to leave them as units for investment and profit. So yes, and the squishy human beings are the unfortunate victims of an economic land grab. Yeah.
And I was also thankful that you brought in this, which I also had to learn in a hard way, like basically this invention of affordable rent. Now you would have social rent, and then you'd hear this nice word of affordable rent.
Yeah.
But affordable only means 20% down the market price. And we can see this, I would say, not only in London, but in many places, even in Vienna, the kind of invention of new, good-sounding words that are just another term for, again, making profits or for the financial product. So I think, I mean, there's just so much we could talk about.
Just talk about that in terms of the language. You know, I mean, I think we see that all the way through these processes is the use of language, which sounds, as you say, very nice, friendly. So regeneration, for example, I mean, that's like a great sounding word. Who wouldn't want to regenerate? It sounds and affordable. And I think it's a deliberate kind of manipulation of language, which encourages people to believe that these are good, positive things that are happening. And to some extent, yeah, I mean, you can't use the word. I can't really use the word affordable now because it's meaningless. They render these words meaningless, and so then what do? So you have to really be clear about the way in which you're using language. And regeneration, I mean, is that a word that's no longer available for me to use, or do I just have to reclaim that word and say, no, what you're talking about is not regeneration? But it really is, language is the first battleground, actually, I think, here, because I think a lot of people don't realize, for example, that affordable is not affordable. You know? And so I think in terms of some of the sort of political and ways in which we can change, you know, one of the things I talk about is how can we change policy, or also not just policy, but a collective consciousness around these things. Part of that is about educating people in terms of language, and certainly the way in which the planning and development language is being used.
No, I think the strategies are very clear, and I think that like to kind of rehumanize or to bring the home back into the idea, to bring the use value back, to also kind of really rather decant the wordings, to really make clear what misuse of wordings is happening there. And when you say you feel like you're part of having rescued the homes of 6,000 Londoners, then these are of all the different developments that have not been generated in the big scheme, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
So to actually make sure to prevent and to win time, because this is also something that it's even difficult to teach. Like, how could we do projects that would literally kind of gain time or make time available for rethinking and possibly installing a process. I think that's something that we could also learn from your activism. And I was just also wondering how how you see yourself. I mean, the situation is changing, and there's so much. I mean, the housing crisis is such an international condition. That's why we are also like literally looking from Vienna to Brno, to Vancouver, London, then Berlin. We could take so many other cities. It's just the cities that we like also happen to know better. So in a way, do you see also a possibility to globally support each other, exchange? I mean, this is something we're even doing here to try to kind of strengthen networks and to see how like what is globally similar as a condition. And so many times I actually mention London as maybe a most radical way of or condition of be it making profit with housing, etc. But you can see it as a pattern in different other cities. So to what extent do you think, and you mentioned it, like there's this need to work super locally, but on the other hand, there's also a need of ours to actually describe the global condition of a very similar pattern in some places. And again, it's a lot of work, but how do you see your to bring these two conditions together?
I think it's really interesting because when we went to Vancouver, we were invited over there a few years ago, which is where we put together the lectures that we presented. And what was very interesting was that there were lots of similarities, but there were also differences. And I think what we learned from that was that we can also gain, we can learn from the solutions that people are coming up with. I mean, for example, there's lots of solutions coming out of Central Europe in terms of, you have a much higher percentage of cooperative housing, for example, like in Vancouver. The cooperative community land trust was something that, in fact, we had sort of come up with. We thought, in the UK, in one of our projects in Brixton, looking at this using the community land trust as a way to appropriate the land, but use the cooperative as a mechanism for managing the properties on that land, for example. And interestingly, in Vancouver, that's something that they have been doing for a while. So I think there's a huge amount that can be learnt. And different sort of strategies, which may be interesting when you sort of take something and apply it in a slightly different context. You may be able to sort of create sort of slightly different and new possibilities. And I do think it has been. I mean, I think it was kind of interesting looking at the sort of policy changes that we've seen. And that was only a few of them, and I could have gone on for a bit longer. I mean, and I'm not trying to claim that we were directly responsible for all those at all. But I think it's interesting that there are changes that have happened, and I've wanted to end on that to give a bit of hope, in the sense that that there are ways of making change happen, and I think it's worth persisting with those things. And yes, the changes ultimately probably will have to have some kind of political or policy kind of agency, but the way they happen, we also have to bring people with us. We have to change kind of ways of behavior, I think. And so it's also about, I suppose, changing things on a very local level, or making things, because the local level is the only way we're going to have any agency, really. So it's about having kind of local agency in a very specific, in a particular way, but then learning about that and then kind of extending and extrapolating that, I suppose, both at a local or national, but then also international level, to be able to. I mean, one of the things that one of my colleagues has been talking about is the Mietshauser Syndicate, I think.
Mietshauser Syndicate, yeah.
And in terms of the loan stock. And so looking at, I mean, because that's not something that's really happening at the moment in the UK, but looking to think, well, okay, because that's a really, really amazing kind of initiative. But we need people who have knowledge of those things to be able to come over, educate. I mean, because the cooperative movement over here is not particularly, so it's quite not as active as it could be. And I think it's got amazing capacity potentially, but it's quite reluctant, dare I say it, at the moment, to become more active.
Last time we actually had Mietshauser Syndicate as our topic, and also the Austrian version of it, Habitat. And we looked at two projects, and we ended on the note of the Czech version of it getting started. So I think there's something about literally how the Austrian network is learning from the Germans, the Czech network will learn from each other, and the same could spill over to the UK and the other way around. So I think this is what I meant with also supporting beyond the borders. I would to ask one last question, but then I really would like to invite everybody else to also prepare your questions. You mentioned a couple of times the housing conditions under capitalism. And then I found that interesting because, I mean, I'm like sitting in Vienna, which is often called kind of a socialist city or like social democrat. And we, of course, we try to discuss literally to get housing out of this capitalist logic, which doesn't mean that, we're not up. But why is that? And I'm aware of the fact, and it's so extremely interesting, I think, to work kind of to relate places like London and Vienna to each other, because the conditions are so extremely different. So is that something that's really important to you to make that clear, that you're not questioning the basic condition per se?
Well, I mean, in a way, I think the point is we're definitely questioning the original, the basic condition. I mean, definitely. I'm not suggesting that we don't want to make radical changes. I mean, I want to get rid of capitalism altogether. But I suppose the point is that to some extent we wanted to, again, a lot of the kind of campaigning that we were kind of doing at the very beginning was about radical political change. And I just feel like if we wait for that to happen, nothing's going to happen. So we kind of have to some extent, accept that these are the current conditions and to see, well, okay, well, within those conditions, what can we do? But that's not to say we shouldn't try and change those bigger picture, but it's, I suppose, about saying, well, to what extent, to what kind of agency do we have? And to think about it, as I say, about thinking about political change happening at a smaller local level, and maybe that rather than, as I say, these changes happening from above coming down, that actually this change happens through these small local initiatives and starts to move upward. I suppose that's the kind of, as if you're talking about a kind of revolution, that's the sort of framework for how we might understand our work in the context of a larger political movement.
Maybe we could call it a non-reformist reform.
I suppose.
That's something I'm really interested in exactly, like how can we actually work on the small steps while we know that bigger ones would be needed, but to keep agency exactly.
But I think your point about the fact that there are many, so in Vienna, you do have a very different system, which is still operating underneath the broad kind of term of capitalist, but there are different ways of being within that system. And I think that's really, really important to learn again about the specifics of that condition. So how might that be improved, but also how might we learn from that situation to kind of say, look, this is not unique. We don't have to do it this way. There's such a kind of sense of, well, this is the way it is. There's nothing we can really do about it. And I think, we have to be really challenging that and being ambitious. And I think to some extent, we need to be really, really ambitious in what we want to achieve, but at the same time, be kind of practical. So I suppose it's a kind of slightly, maybe they don't necessarily marry up together, but yeah.
We sometimes try to call it in our unit pragmatic utopianism.
Oh, okay, I like that. Yes,
that sounds you could turn it the other way around.
Okay. Utopian pragmatism or whatever, yeah.
Okay, Carolina, do you see any questions, or I would like to invite everybody to join the discussion or ask Geraldine about architecture, social housing. Go ahead, Carolina.
So far, I don't see anyone wanting to ask, but everyone is welcome. Just join us. But I have some thoughts. First, just to make it clear, if you are working on some, let's say, refurbishment or additions or improvements for housing, you are basically commissioned by the community and you fight against the council, which has the project of the demolition, which I find quite interesting, that it's a land of the council, and the council, which I always believed should have the public good in mind, are basically fighting against the residents, and has a proposal that, as you proved, or I don't know, as you say, is not economically, socially, environmentally, whatever, viable. That I don't understand why it's not you or similar architects who are commissioned by the council to bring the improvements into the housing that and that leads me to, so basically it's only the council who would, or maybe the private developer who would then develop the new houses, who would profit from the scheme which is proposed by the council, which you are fighting against. And also I'm wondering, like, what is your position among the other architects who are usually working either for the council or for the private developer, or like why there are so few of you, or are there more architects who are involved in similar actions as architects for social housing?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, and it's something that I brought up quite recently about the kind of conflict of architects. And I think this also comes back to the social and economic situation of the architect. We don't exist outside of the market, essentially. We are competing for work, and when I say we, I don't mean architects social housing. I mean architects as a collective body. And I mean, interestingly, when Western and Gibbs Green, for example, I was approached by the residents then, and they did have a small, tiny pot of money to spend on doing the project, as I say, the alternative to demolition, working for the residents there. And we hadn't done a project of that scale before. So I approached a number of architects that I thought had worked on schemes of that size, had a kind of an ethical kind of position, were building social housing. And this is at the very, very beginning. So I was very naive. And I approached a number of them. One of them said it wasn't enough money. They couldn't do it. Another one said that they were already working for the council and the developer on other schemes. So it would be in a conflict. It would essentially it would compromise their relationship with the council and the developer. And the third one, I think, was also working, in fact, on the same scheme, but on the demolition scheme. So I think architects, primarily the architectural corporation is a private enterprise, fundamentally interested in keeping itself afloat financially. So there you have a problem whereby their motivation quite often is also for the most lucrative scheme. I mean, if you compare the St. Raphael scheme, so our proposal was 190 million to refurbish and improve the estate, whereas the full demolition and redevelopment scheme is 500 million. Yeah, so the architects, I think there is a financial incentive for them to demolish, to go for a full demo, because their fees are going to be vastly superior. And I mean, maybe that's me being very cynical, possibly, but there is an economic motivation for the architectural practice to be pursuing larger schemes. You mentioned some of your other issues around. What was your other question earlier before that? Sorry.
No, I just wondered, why aren't you commissioned by the council if you are able to show that you have a better proposal than the council?
I mean, I'm also bemused. To be honest, yeah, I think what's interesting is that it's only now, I think, that people are starting to realise that, for example, firstly, the environmental argument. Yeah, I mean, it's only really been in the last couple of years where the argument that you cannot just demolish these homes, that's only very recently been accepted as a kind of serious position. Yeah, I mean, it was very fringe. Even a few years ago, embodied carbon was not really discussed. And it's only now that they're making it an imperative on these big schemes to provide an embodied carbon estimate and an environmental impact. So it's only now whether those things are starting to become seriously considered as a kind of as something of genuine importance for local authorities, and that's only been in the last couple of years. And so I think economically, I mean, their motivation is just to build more housing, and they like to see, okay, look, we've built an extra 1,000 homes. That's part of their political manifesto. So at the beginning of every political election, new campaign, one of the political manifestos will be, in the next period, we will build an extra 1,000 new council homes, however many. So it's a political motivation as well to build more housing. They don't say what kind of housing that's going to be. And as I've shown, at the moment now, the way in which again this terminology is shifting, again, it's a very subtle shift, is that councils are setting up their own housing associations. So they're called a local, can't remember the name of it now actually, but they're called special purpose vehicle. So
what's the name?
Special purpose vehicle. Uh-huh. And I think they've got like something like a local housing company, but a special purpose vehicle is the general term. So a council will set up basically what is a private company, but it will be wholly owned by the council. And under that, they can then develop that land, and they will develop that, and they will build 50% for market sale, for example. But they could call that council housing. Mm-hmm. Because it's on their land, so I think, again, it's this illusion, this very subtle illusion of terminology. And they can say, look, we built an extra 1,000 homes. And affordable housing, again, as we've seen, affordable up to 80% of market is not affordable. And yet it's the umbrella term where they can say, well, look, we built an extra 1,000 affordable homes. Aren't we fantastic? So there is a political motivation to, and in the demolition and rebuilding, if they can build an increase in the number of homes, which they can do, they look good. But in fact, what you end up with is a decrease in the number of social homes, which again is not something which is really exposed.
Geraldine, before, is there any questions in the audience already? Michelle, did you have one already?
Yeah, hi, I actually have a question, but it's not entirely related to social housing, but should I maybe quickly introduce myself? I'm Michelle. I'm actually a student of Gabu at the Architecture Association in London, and what you've been talking about is extremely relevant to my topic because I'm actually working on on the Aylesbury estate in Southwark, which kind of dealing with the empty properties on the estate, and to kind of use my project, my final year project, as a kind of resistance towards, you know, housing estate demolition and regeneration, that sort of turning that the kind of housing in the public realm into the public sphere into the market. And that when you talk about affordable housing, is extremely I'm extremely triggered because that is kind of informing housing is being transferred from, you know, the state to the market. The term affordable is kind of has this sort of connotation, and that's really triggering to me because Gabu just mentioned something about housing condition under capitalism, and I think that's a very interesting idea as well, especially in this day and age, and especially the capitalist city like London. And there's obviously in parallel to estate demolition, there's also kind of, you know, a lot of development, private development in the pipelines, you know, building, and most of them are kind of left empty in recent years. And I'm just wondering, what do you think about those, and what do we, as, you know, the architect, the practicing architects, or the kind of the government or the council could do, and kind of how to tackle these kind of condition? What's your thought on that?
Difficult questions. Very good questions. Thank you. So, I mean, it's interesting. You talk about empty homes, and I'm wondering which, because at the moment, I mean, the Aylesbury estate is being emptied out because it's going to be demolished. But the other side of the empty homes is, you know, from where I am, I can see across to the Battersea power station development. And, you know, we look at these new developments that have gone up, and especially at night time, you can see, I mean, not necessarily Battersea, which hasn't yet been completed, most of it, but some of the newer ones in Vauxhall, you can look and you have these towers and they're also empty. So there's something kind of very interesting about this emptiness, both in terms of the decanting. So before something gets demolished, you need to empty it of its kind of humanity. And even once it's built, you know, the vast majority of these properties, I think, as I said in my meetings, 50% of them are sold potentially to investors who will never live there. And I think with the problem, what this clearly kind of demonstrates is that, you know, it's the removal of the home or the unit of housing as the home as use value. Yeah, it's not a home anymore. It's simply either a place of temporary occupation. So quite often what happens on these estates when the Aylesbury estate, you know, it'll have taken 20, 30 years probably by the time it gets finished, maybe even longer. And so you have this process, I mean, that's a generation, you know, that's a long process of emptying out. And during that process, what happens is actually a lot of temporary occupation of those homes. And again, is that, you know, you may get people who are moved in there for, you know, a few months, a few years, in very different kind of tenure conditions. So they're not given a proper, they're given a very, very short-term contract. They're often things like property guardianships as well, interestingly. So they're often where these homes on these estates will be rented out for very little money, but with absolutely no legal rights at all. And they're not even deemed, that you have a license, I think, to occupy, which is not actually even you don't have a housing, you don't actually have a contract, but you have a license to occupy. And I think this is a very interesting kind of question, actually, because it really does bring into frame these issues around the use of this building, you know. And I think it's all, you know, the temporary use of these buildings they're not being used as homes, they're being used as vehicle opportunities for investment, and the same thing at the other end, at the other end of the housing, where you've got these kind of several million pound or 20 million pounds, whatever they are, kind of, flats that are sitting there half a mile up in the sky that will actually they will be devalued if somebody lives in them. So again, the value of that is directly associated with its emptiness, and purely as this financial asset. And so I think it's somehow, and that goes back to some of these bigger questions about how do we decouple, to use it for a strange phrase, but how do we disconnect? And I think that goes back to Gabu's earlier position in terms of taking housing out of the market, which essentially is kind of putting it back into its use as a home. And I think that's really at the core of I think how capitalism relates to housing, not as a home, but as an investment. And I think that's, so I suppose your question is, what can we do? And I think if in policy terms, if there was some way of, and I don't know whether that could happen all at once or whether that's a sequential series of policy changes, that would enable that disconnection to take place. I mean, the Community Land Trust is one of those small scale, I think, kind of incremental mechanisms, I think, to do that, to decouple the land from the market. And so I think, again, this goes back to the question of what are things that we can do that were within our current sort of system, as it were, that can operate. So a community land trust could operate within the capitalist system, but can extract itself from it. And so, so I think, the bigger question is, how do we do that for all property and land? And the first question, I suppose, is how do we do it incrementally, and can we do it on a local level? So it's kind of simultaneously looking at the bigger policy changes while being able to say, how can we actually make this thing happen on the ground? So, West Kensington and Gibbs Green estates, the residents there, and Cressingham Gardens as well, actually, I think, are making applications to transfer the estates into their own ownership, to turn it into effectively a kind of tenant management organization.
Is that really happening on a big scale? I mean, how big can the scale be? Because if we look into like what community land trusts or Mietshäuser syndicat structures, I know them mostly in smaller scale, and I would be really, and that's why we're interested in Deutsche Wohnen AG, like big scale questions of collectivizing, but in London, like the examples you bring, how big is the scale?
The first one that I think was first and maybe the only estate that ever did this transfer was back in the 90s, and I think it's called the Walterton and Elgin estate. And that was, I think there was a kind of strange moment in time where sort of policies coincided and then slightly changed or whatever. So, and I think that's, I would imagine that's at least 100 or more homes. Okay. The other one that is interesting is the Leather Market, JMB, which is a joint management board. And that's a council estate, which is still council-owned land. But the land is managed by primarily a resident board, as far as I understand it. So they're also really interesting as a kind of as a precedent for a different kind of management, but keeping that's retained the land in council ownership, but the residents are able to, and they're also developing. So they've developed quite a lot of that properties on that estate and building, which is very rare, and that's a huge estate.
I think this is now we're really at this point, which I find interesting in terms of every place has its own history of resistance, its own history of struggles, its own history of alternatives. And to some extent, we can learn from each other, but we can most learn from alternatives that have happened already. And that's why I think it's so valuable. We should make much more visible examples in the past where larger scale housing estates have been actually transferred into self-management, if I understand it correct, or even like collective ownership structures, CLT structures, and because that's what we are looking for in many places. And to learn from such examples is great. And so I think that's really super valuable also for you, Michelle, to look into such schemes that have happened in London and actually give a good precedence, a good example that is possible. And Geraldine, I'm also happy because I've never, you just made me really combine, I mean, logically it's combined, but to think the empty, structurally empty homes of investment, speculation, development, and the process of slowly emptying out, for instance, Aylesbury housing estates or those estates that are being regenerated. I think we must much more, like, literally think these empty homes together, or think them structurally, how they relate to each other. And I mean, this is not yet on the project level, but on the analytical level, it's a very good move. And on the project level, I really think to look into historic or even early, more recent historic examples and see how they actually give the starting point for maybe yet bigger, or thinking even bigger, or thinking further. I think it's great.
Thank you, Michelle.
I just wanted to emphasize the idea of the dehumanization of the housing currently. That you also mentioned that for the councils, it was kind of a political manifesto to say, oh, we will build 1,000 more housing, and it happens also in the Czech Republic that the discussion is always around like how many units were got the building permission, or how many units were built, and who was more successful in giving these permissions or building these units, and no one mentions for whom these houses will be affordable or not affordable, or how many. I mean, I think currently that doesn't happen that much in the Czech Republic, that there would be housing demolished and people pushed out, but I can imagine in London it's an interesting to point out that like there are people living and having the place considered as their home, and the politician can simply say no, we will demolish it and place there other 1,000 people, or I don't know. And I also like the idea where you mentioned that you are taking pictures of people in their flat, so you can use it for the campaign or something that the public can imagine it has some meaning. And I know that if someone is interested, I know that in Vienna there is this Kunst im öffentlichen Raum art in public space program, or city organization which provide funding, and there were a lot of projects of creators or artists who worked in social housing and did similar things like I don't know, exhibiting art in the house, in the flats, or working with the locals and so on. So I think we shouldn't lose this idea that the home is, or like a unit is someone's home.
I think it's also interesting in terms of part of what we knew was a real issue was the negative preconceptions that people have collectively around social housing, that it's a place of crime, of antisocial behaviour, that it's dirty, that people are criminal, all this kind of stuff, which is a kind of an accepted sort of hugely negative preconceptions around this kind of housing. And that's deliberate. That's deliberately kind of being promoted as a mechanism for facilitating its destruction. I think, part of this is about challenging those preconceptions. And I think that's something that when I gave a very, very short talk a few years ago at a kind of very corporate event, and it was around sort of women in doing kind of things in sort of good deeds. And I was one of those women doing good deeds, sort of sitting on a sort of platform. And there was kind of about 300 people from this kind of very, very corporate sort of management organization. It was sort of International Women's Day, I think it was. And I gave a very short sort of talk around the intersectionality and how, these housing estates and the demolition of them was extremely disruptive and devastating for these local communities. And afterwards, the kind of CEO of this organization came up to me. He's kind of, sort of white man in his 60s, obviously probably earning quite a considerable amount of money. And I don't think he'd ever been on a council estate in his life. And he came up to me. One of the things, so I'll just briefly say, one of the things that he said, that they all asked you, what would you like people to take away from this discussion? And I said, well, okay, next time you go home, everybody lives in London within, a couple of 100 yards of a council estate. Most people, because they're very spread around. take a walk through the estate and have a little look at it. And the CEO came up to me afterwards and said, I never even imagined people actually wanted to live there. I kind of, because all we're told relentlessly is that these places are horrible and disgusting, and and he said, I'd never imagined that actually these were people's homes, and that they might. I think people assume that they want to be demolished because they don't want to live there. And I think again, it's about this huge disconnection between the communities that live in these places and the communities that don't. So again, we have this, when we're talking about inequality, we have this kind of segregation of these sort of wealth disparities, which have just no relationship to each other at all.
Geraldine, this is maybe a moment that I wanted to question something which I myself am doing, and I think maybe we should self-critically question, to fight economics with economics, or to fight numbers with numbers, because I think we just kind of discussed how also councils have numbers in their head, and the question, of course, is, for instance, when I saw your model, and I think it's very clear, it's very convincing to say, okay, this is the number now, and then we would have a larger number, and the council also has a larger number, but reclaims it and so on. So, but we are, of course, in the complete abstract numbering, and we are kind of responding in the language, and this is really bothering me, because I do think that I've really supported a lot. I mean, I'm supporting projects like now in my students in Nuremberg. I'm supporting them really calculating what profits is being done and recalibrating and saying what could be done by that numbers and so on. So it is a kind of a response with this. But if we would find a way to maybe go completely berserk, or like even like irrational in just quality, in just art, as you mentioned, I think it was great, Carolina, that you brought in art in architecture, art on the construction side, to say we need actually maybe completely irrational or absolute beauty or luxury for all concepts.
Well, if the art is not in the hand of the developer and doesn't work for the gentrification.
Understood. Yes, but you know what I mean, in terms of like that we kind of disrupt this logic and then come back with the idea of a home, the idea of like neighborhoods, the idea of quality, the idea of and so on. Because at the end, what I hear from also your work, the numbers don't do it anyway.
I mean, I think what's interesting is you're talking about this. It's about values, isn't it? But systems of values, and I think at the very beginning of my introduction, I talked about saying it's very easy to quantify the economic and the environmental costs. We can add them up, we can count, we can have numbers, but it's much harder to talk about the social costs, because ultimately that stuff that is about talking to people and getting stories. And so I think, in a way, some of the drawing that I showed, which was the sort of this almost like a cartoony drawing with the residents' kind of voices in it, that's, I think, speaks much more to the people who were there as well. And I also think it speaks, because you're right, it's about using different kinds of language to talk about the same thing. I mean, interestingly, there's a woman called Ulrike Gittner, who is an architect. I don't know if you know, she's an architect who's, or an artist architect who's working, she's doing a PhD, and she's working with us at St. Raphael's to explore different kinds of ways of communicating. So it's very much what you're saying, and the work that she makes is quite crazy, and it's very it's not irrational at all. There is a rationale there, but it's not the kind of communication that you would expect. And I think you're right, there's something about, because on the one hand, we know that we can I think part of what we're doing in terms of showing the numbers, we're saying, well, we can actually beat you on your argument. And I think to some extent we needed to demonstrate that we could do that. But even so, but you're right, I think there is something which, in terms of a bigger discussion about values, no, we're just meeting them at their values rather than sort of saying, well, hang on a minute, if we want to make much more radical changes, then yes, I think the language also needs to change. And we've talked at ASH, actually, we talked a lot about how visually we needed to find like an architectural language that didn't look like, the language of the developer or the language of, and that's difficult, actually.
I think that's exactly where I wanted to head into. But I do think that as architects, we have a duty to actually find an alternative architectural language and an alternative architectural also concept of what, because if we want to convince or propose, then alternatives, they should be alternatives rather than just alternatives in numbers. And so there's something about, and it's really something that I wanted to say in terms of all of us, of course, working very often, mostly on again, kind of the, concepts, the images and so on, and to not give that up, because there's something about, or like literally like building models, doing the working on the urban, formal, conceptual, you claim it, kind of concepts of also giving alternatives to the housing schemes, because at the end, I think there's something about having people fight for something that would just look similar again. Or like that, I mean, this is, I think, what makes people give up so easily on whether it's that or that housing. I've heard so many times, well, at the end, I don't even care. Is it communal housing? Is it private housing? Is it like, it is about affordability, but this isn't even assured. So at the end, there's nothing to fight for. So in a way, to produce this, to fight for visions, it's something that we also kind of need to implement. So we have so much to do, all of us.
Yeah.
Natalia, do you want to ask something?
Yeah, hello. I would have two questions. Just shortly to introduce myself, or first of all, thanks for this great discussion. I'm so sad that I missed the first round of the talks. I just discovered it today. But yeah, I'm happy to be joining now. Yeah, just briefly about myself. I just recently finished a master thesis on the current state of housing in Cape Town, South Africa. And I was looking at the financialization aspect of housing. So yeah, I have two questions. So the first one is rather a follow-up question of what Gabu Heindl said earlier. And it is the problem of thinking more globally, or the question of thinking more globally. And I was thinking of, since I was rather concentrating on a southern city, there's this notion of a urbanist that I follow, Jennifer Robinson, conceptualizing on ordinary cities. So yeah, I somehow got inspired by your question initially to think there's a lot of responses in other parts of the world, and what I still see is that we are conceptualizing and theorizing in reference to still very northern concepts, and I know that we're coming from historical embeddedness, but still, like, how could you see synergies look like in your work, especially with London? I was also thinking about the vibrating diaspora communities and how much diverse communities could be involved in this. That's my first question. I don't know if you want to respond to this first. Or...
I mean, if the questions are connected or not?
No, rather not. No.
So I think, I mean, the question, I suppose, is how much can we learn from maybe very different or very diverse kind of urban contexts? Is that, or, I mean, because to be honest, I think, I mean, I would say that, I mean, again, you're right, because there is a phrase, the global south and the north, and they're considered to be different. I don't know enough about what that means, to be what the global south means as an urban construct, to be honest. I don't think. I think that personally, I think that our system has failed. So frankly, we can learn from everywhere. It's got something to teach us. But I think the condition in Cape Town is going to be different from the conditions in Chile, which is going to be different to the conditions. And I think, we need to learn more from the way in which other people do things, because frankly, our system is has failed. I'm not entirely sure what your because as I say, like I mean, I'm open to learning from everybody's backgrounds, and I think we've made a mess up of it.
I think
in terms of the local engagement of communities in London who are historically and also from a class background and a race background rather excluded. How is your experience? How are you working with?
Yeah, I mean, I think interestingly, I mean, the vast majority of the communities in social housing are non-white communities, large percentage of people. And I think what's interesting is that there is very little recognition of their different cultural needs, actually. And as I say, I think that we could learn a lot more. I mean, I think one of the failings of our society is a breakdown in sort of communal and community living. Yeah, I mean, we're kind of very, very atomized. You know, I live on the kind of 10th floor of a tower block, which does have a strong community, but London as a city is very disconnected. Doesn't have, and I think that there is possibly things to be learned about different kinds of communal ways of living, which are not traditionally Western or certainly not traditionally UK based forms of living, but are maybe coming from other parts of the world. Yeah, and I think there are ways in which we can learn from certainly collective living, which could be really beneficial, both on a social level, but also in terms of how we manage our housing. Definitely.
Maybe I could just add something in terms of I think it's again a very similar question in terms of there's a global finding out the global structural similarities or analogies. But then again, I think the global is in the local. I mean, like even in Vienna, I've worked with intersectional groups of people with and without papers, with different skin color, with different needs and possibilities. And I think the great thing is that that in terms of, let's say differently, the question more is how do you as an architect get in touch and actually relate and find ways of creating synergies. And I think that's something that I've been because honestly, for a long time that I was myself in, public talks and so on, I often saw myself being addressed as the enemy. Not me personally, but the architect is the enemy. Because we are actually supporting those who are driving people out of the houses. We are, as a profession, we have been kind of those who would rather choose to work with a speculative investor than with those who have hardly any money, but may also, and I do think to find ways to become friend or to become trusted, really, it's a long time, and it literally needs the building up of trust. But I can really see how I'm part of communities that are so intersectional. It's like class, race, gender. It's all there, and I can become kind of a part of their we can literally work together rather than me working for them or and suddenly there's a different way of claiming spaces. The only other issue is why we are setting up such talks and talking about policy levels is that, I would say that there's an enormous potential for self-empowerment, especially when it comes to housing. I mean, like literally everybody's an expert in how you would collectively want to live together. But the thing is that the structural conditions are so awfully bad in literally every place that of many people I know, independent of kind of from their backgrounds, who would actually absolutely know how they would, start self-initiated housing schemes. They cannot, because you cannot find any condition that you could literally work on. To find a house where you could live together collectively, to find a piece of land that you could actually decapitalize and take out of the market would mean that you actually already have the money of the market to be part of that structure. So that's why I believe global local, but also in a way policy and popular agency and ways of like bottom up. So yeah, again, not to be too I think we should try to learn and connect as much as we can, what we can, because the kind of the power on the other side is much larger in a way.
I mean, I think this goes back to, again, like a sort of even bigger issue around movement of people. Yeah, and we're looking at refugees for all sorts of reasons, and we're getting a greater and greater movement of people across the world. And I'm wondering about how that impacts on the kind of architectural responses that will be needed. I mean, are we increasingly seeing more and more people living in very temporary or supposedly temporary kind of camp conditions? You know, the sort of the refugee camp as a form of kind of urban life. I mean, this is not a positive side. This is, as I say, kind of like a very negative kind of way in which the sort of the globalization has produced a kind of a very transient group of people who don't have a connection to where they're living, and that's a big question, I think, about how we deal with that at a local level. I think it's going to increase and become more and more of an issue, I think, when we talk about, you know, if there's, you know, significant climate change. You know, there are going to be this movement of people across borders, for example. You know, is going to, I can't see it getting less, as it were. I can imagine it's going to become, and so I think the way in which housing sort of deals with some of those things is really important.
I think, Natalie, what you brought up is really like an urgent need to redo the development of, you know, Le Corbusier as a house for all seasons. Well, not a house for all seasons, a house for all countries, for all places. What is for all around the world? I don't know the exact term, but
like a universal house or something.
Yeah, I think you know, the kind of 21-degree house that you could literally have in every place with the same modernist technique of building it. And this is, and I think it's been mentioned today sometimes. Geraldine, you mentioned it, the ecological argument. It's so sad that maybe, you know, this is the one that can, however, at this moment be really empowering, or can be used, because if at this moment we would at least, for any social, global and local reasons, I have no problems with saying, okay, it is at the end, at least if people acknowledge it's an ecological issue of what materials we choose to work in, what the efficiency of means is with its outcomes. And I think this is where, for instance, I mean, literally, alternative materials, clay, wood, straw, you name it. And I'm not saying that this is naturally kind of connected to the local south, global south, not at all. But it's something about being able to work with much less material, and we're discussing heavily, of course, if any concrete should be used. I mean, I just recently joined a discussion about that, a complete moratorium on concrete building until kind of those places that literally still need concrete for some structures are secured, while in some places, you know, it's just simply possible not to use it. But then again, okay, that sometimes means, and we're coming back to empty houses, sometimes the best built house is the one not built, and that would literally mean to reuse as anything that is there, and that's again policy level.
I mean, I think the issue that I mentioned around the degrowth, you know, as a kind of as an economic necessity. I remember a couple of years ago we were in Berlin with some of my students at the time, and there was a presentation there given by the authors of a book called, I think it was Housing and Degrowth, I think. And I think a lot of the architects, the students, were really kind of found that a really difficult concept. It's like, well, hang on a minute, you know, I'm training to be an architect, which is to design buildings. And yet we're sort of saying, well, hang on a minute, you know, maybe that's not what we need, is not more buildings. I mean, I'm not, obviously that's a very blanket statement, but I think there needs to be a sort of change in the way in which people understand their role as an architect. And I think that is happening through the environmental kind of discussion. And I think that just needs to sort of filter through to the social and the economic sphere. It's an economic and an environmental sort of a debate, isn't it? But I think architects still sort of struggle a little bit with the idea that, maybe building is bad, or building more, is not necessarily always the right thing to do. And I think that's going to have to take quite a culture shift within a kind of an architectural mindset to realize that that they need to maybe rethink some of those very basic principles of what an architect, is.
Well, I think that could be closing words. Caroline, what do you think? We don't hear you, but I just
don't know
feel
if
like
Natalie wanted to ask the second question, but I also like the growth.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine.
But your hand was still up, so please.
Okay. So I have to.
No, you don't have to at all. Yeah. We just didn't know if you had another question.
Yeah, no, I had another question, but I see it's almost 9 p.m. So yeah.
That's what I also felt like. Yeah, maybe it's. I think what is so great to see is that we could actually continue to discuss. That, I mean, there's so much open questions and questions to work on that we won't finish that tonight. And I think it's also nice to keep some off-screen time for ourselves. I wished we could have a drink now all together, everybody. Also, thank you for the questions, and we'll hope to. But on the other hand, what is great is we can build international ties, obviously, as we just saw. That's so beautiful, which we couldn't do so easily if we were just local. So
yeah,
thank you, Carolina, for making this option.
I would say the same. Let's close this event tonight, but everyone can join us again with our next events. One with the guests from Vancouver on 23rd of February, and then the guests from Berlin probably on the 1st of March. And we are very much looking forward, and I think we can come back to some of those questions because it's all related and continue the discussion. So thank you very much, Geraldine, for joining us tonight and giving the talk. Hope to see you maybe at some point in person. And good luck with the project.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yep. See you everyone next time. Thank you. Have a good evening.